that's everything from small-scale third-party co-location all the way up to big greenfield sites. I've been at Google for about 13 years, actually be 13 years in August, and so we're only a 20-ish year old company, and so that I've seen a lot of change at Google. Just to give you a little bit of history, when I first came to Google, I was working on big greenfield projects, but we actually had a pretty big third-party co-location portfolio. Obviously, that was sort of the first phase of Google's growth. We got into third-party colo, and actually one of my first jobs was to try to get us out of co-location as we were moving more toward these hyperscale greenfield campuses. What's interesting is that about 3 or 4 years ago, with the advent of cloud, suddenly colo was in the game again. And since then, a very large part of my business is not just dealing with traditional wholesale colo, but beginning to really investigate different kinds of models, bigger chunks of capacity, more flexible space in different locations around the world. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, a little bit more about how we think about vendors, how we work with vendors, what the future might hold, which frankly nobody really knows with respect to cloud. Everybody's got sort of a different perspective on where the industry will go, but I'll try to give you a little bit of insight what ours is. There we go. Uh-oh. All right. Excellent. So the first question to ask, and this is frankly what we ask at Google as we build our global footprint, is what do our customers want? And thinking about third-party co-location, we've gotten really good at building and operating our own data centers end-to-end, and we control the environment. When we get into a third-party co-location space, obviously we lose a little bit of that control. And so it's really important. We wanted to communicate today that when we think about what our customers want, we want also our co-location providers to think about what our customers want. It's got to translate into that environment. Our customers need to be protected in the same way that they would be protected inside of our own facilities. What are those things? These are what we consider to be Google's data center principles when we think about service to our customers. And we have a range of customers, obviously. We have Gmail and Search and all of these incredible products that we've built internally. But increasingly with cloud, we have external enterprise customers, all kinds of customers that will use the cloud. And so we've had to adjust a bit our culture, adjust a bit to making sure that the needs of those customers are satisfied over time. And so it's important for our third-party partners to also understand that they need to embody these principles as well. The first one I'll talk about is really with respect to performance, and that's making sure we have high compute performance around the world. Now, Google was one of the first companies, well before I actually came to the company, that started to build its own servers. We knew early on that the servers that you buy on the market had lots of extra stuff that we didn't need and stuff that we didn't want to pay for. And so Google at its heart is an engineering company, and so our engineers, of course, had to start dismantling servers to figure out what are the pieces that we really need. What does this particular server need that isn't needed by this particular server based on the job it needs to do? And so over the years, we've developed many iterations of our own platforms that have increasing efficiency. Just as an example, the amount of compute that we get today is, out of a single kilowatt hour of energy, is 7 times more efficient than the amount of compute capacity that we had just 5 years ago. And so we continually iterate on these extremely high-performing platforms. And so making sure that, and obviously when we design and build our own data centers, they're very specialized to maximize the performance of those platforms. It's a challenge when we get into the third-party environment. And increasingly we have IP concerns because there's a lot of IP invested in this equipment. And so we need to make sure that the third-party environment that we're in protects that IP and meets the needs of that IP, meets the needs of those servers from a technical perspective. Availability, obviously the concept of 5 nines availability, we can control that in our own environment, but it's also something that we expect from our partners. But also a global reach. My team is responsible for locating data centers, whether they're in India or whether they're in Northern Virginia, or whether they're in Amsterdam. We expect to have a global network of third parties that can reach into every corner of the earth. Cloud especially is a product that proliferates around the world. We're seeing more and more requirements for data residency, and so working with third-party providers who can get us into markets quickly and allow us to have that global reach that we need, in addition to the facilities that we're building ourselves all the time. Reliability, I talked a little bit about this in terms of uptime, but when we obviously design and build our own facilities, we allow for concurrent maintenance. We make sure that these facilities can be up and running at all times. When we look at third-party facilities, we do exhaustive audits. We look for redundancies. We look for the same ability to do concurrent maintenance. We make sure that you have backup chillers, that you have backup equipment, that if a generator goes down, we need to know exactly how quickly you're going to be able to replace that generator. We're more dependent on a third-party supply chain than we otherwise would be. And so that uptime and reliability is really important. Security, obviously, a big issue. I don't know if anybody has ever seen a Google data center campus, but these are massive industrial facilities, and the security begins from the outside. Berms, fences, gates, and as you move inside the data center, we actually have laser motion detectors, biometrics, you name it, all the way down to the servers themselves. And obviously, anything that moves over the network is encrypted. And so it's not just on the sort of physical layer, it goes all the way down into the software layer. And so security, again, we don't control this environment necessarily. And as a company that has relied for a long time on our own facilities, it makes us nervous when we suddenly have to depend more on a third-party facility. And so I just emphasize, be sensitive to that. We spend a lot of time negotiating security SLAs. We put a lot of our own security infrastructure inside even third-party facilities. And we go to extreme measures to protect the security of our users. That's really the #1 goal within the data center environment, other than safety. And the last thing, and I'll talk a little bit about this, Kelly touched on this with respect to sustainability. This has been an absolutely critical part of Google's mission since before I actually came to the company, and so it goes way back. But sustainability is core to everything that we do. It's also increasingly important to our cloud customers. And so we're trying to bring the third-party market, third-party colocation market along with us. And so I'll talk a little bit about that and what our philosophy is around that. And instead of maybe me giving you an expectation, this actually gives us an opportunity to partner. And we see great opportunity to partner together to actually move more quickly and have bigger momentum. So these are our basic principles. Moving on, everybody's probably familiar, and hopefully everybody uses search every day in Gmail and all these amazing products. This is what drives the majority of our data center demand. And I put this up there because I just want to emphasize, we talked a little bit today about the Internet of Things and everything sort of having a compute element to it in the future, whether it's your thermostat in your house or your car or whatever. And Google now has 8 products with over 1 billion daily users, which is just massive. The amount of compute around the world just needed to support that work is tremendous. I'm extremely busy doing new sites around the world all the time. But the thing I would emphasize here, and GCP, Google Cloud product, I would add to this, is a very fast-growing part of our business. It needs data center infrastructure. And when we think about a portfolio of solutions in the market and satisfying the needs of these customers, it is about more than just Google building big campuses around the world. It will demand a lot of the third-party colocation market as well. We're clearly seeing that with GCP, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's even relevant to meeting the needs of this massive set of products that we've developed. But really, people like to talk about GCP and the cloud environment. And truly, that has driven, when I talk about this transition to working with the colocation market again over the past 3 or 4 years, when we were sort of weaning ourselves off of it, it really is driven by the advent of cloud and GCP. And this market is changing very, very rapidly, as everyone knows. What's challenging for Google with respect to the cloud is that the products that I showed you on the last page, Gmail and search and all of these things, we have a long history with those products. We sort of know what the future looks like. We have historical growth. We can sort of predict what we might need in terms of capacity. We generally can predict where we need it, et cetera. Cloud is a wild card, right? I've heard anywhere from 10 to 20% of enterprises are currently on the cloud, and then only a fraction of their workloads are actually on the cloud. And so everybody talks about this massive shift that will happen into the top 3 or 4 or 5 cloud providers. We call it sort of an S-curve. There's going to be this steep sort of jump. Nobody really knows when that's going to happen. There are different influences. Maybe the economy will impact it. Technology impacts it. We're also seeing rapid change in models, right? So this concept of hybrid cloud. A few years ago, it was just an AWS story and this presumption that everybody will move to AWS and be locked into that provider. But you've seen Microsoft come up quickly. You've seen Google come up quickly. And we're moving more toward a sort of open source perspective. So Google is very much focused on this concept of containers. And so we have this thing called Kubernetes, and we just launched just this spring this product called Anthos. And the idea is that it actually gives a lot of flexibility. It gives flexibility for companies to maybe keep some jobs on-prem. Maybe they can keep it in third party. Maybe they can have multiple cloud providers. They can have bits and pieces of this different species of compute in a sense, and it can be contained inside a management container. And then if they want, they can shift it over to an AWS or a GCP or whatever. And so this environment is changing very rapidly, and it's evolving as we speak. And there's a lot of interesting advantages to being able to containerize and keep it on-prem or keep it in someone else's data center. It becomes a much more flexible chunk of capacity to move around and frankly, more predictable. And so this landscape is moving very quickly. Now, there are lots of players in cloud, but everybody knows really the 4 big ones, right? You have Alibaba, Microsoft, Google, and of course AWS, who's been in this business for a long time. There are lots of other players, obviously, and lots of other important players. I don't mean to diminish those folks at all. But the fact of the matter is those 4 players are growing faster generally than the industry in general. And so they have a tremendous amount of momentum. And Kelly brought up some really interesting points today about the concept of multi-cloud. And this is, I talked a little bit about this, but this concept that cloud providers are going to probably want a multi-cloud, or enterprise is going to want a multi-cloud solution. They predict that, there are some predictions that in the next, let's say, 2 years, that number will jump from 75 to 88%-ish of enterprises that are going to pursue a multi-cloud strategy. And they do that for a couple of reasons. I think number one, they don't really know which cloud company to bet on. There are several leading cloud companies here, and all of them have really interesting product mixes and suites of products. And in fact, some companies are stronger in some areas than others, and so maybe they want to run some workloads on certain aspects of one company's suite and some on another aspect of another company's suite, but basically diversify a little bit their bet. The other is, it's something that Google has really bet on that we believe in, is that companies don't want to be locked in. You're locking in with a single provider. What happens down the road when they don't provide you the suite of products that you need to run your business, or you're limited in some way and you can't lift and shift your compute or your jobs over to another cloud provider, or you can't sort of split up between cloud providers. And so we believe that there's a desire to not get locked in to a particular provider, and I think that's also driving this concept of multi-cloud. So back to me and what my team does and how this all sort of relates to what we do, especially in the context of how we work with colocation providers. I'm fairly agnostic about the space and power solution that I bring to bear for the company. My customers are all of those products that I showed you, all of those product areas. It's certainly increasingly GCP. I spend probably easily 50% of my time just interfacing with our cloud organization internally, thinking about the future of space and power. And so our job is really a consultative one internally. We're responsible for providing basically the right product. And so we look at our capacity planning process and we figure out what is the right space and power product to provide for this particular need. And it could be anything from a 3 or 4 megawatt co-location site in city A, or it could be a very large greenfield site somewhere in the central region of the United States. We're really focused on figuring out what the right product is for the customer need. And that's important as we work with co-location providers for you to understand we're just trying to solve a business problem. And the more you can help us solve that business problem together, the more successful we'll be. Obviously, the right place. And this is actually super important, especially in the co-location world. Google is really good at building data centers. But we may not be the best company to jump into a particular market and get something built within 24 months. Sometimes we're a little bit slow. Sometimes we don't have the resources on the ground in a particular location. And that's a good example of an opportunity for us to work with an incumbent third-party co-location provider in that market to help us get to market faster, to help us get a footprint, to hopefully have something that we can scale with. And predictable time frame. So this is really important. I don't guarantee timeframes to my product areas necessarily. A lot of people in this room are involved with big infrastructure development, and millions of things can go wrong. Lots of delays, lots of things can happen. But it is important to these customers to have a predictable timeframe, a reasonable guarantee that if they need to be in market X, I can provide you space and power in a predictable manner. It's really hard to compress timelines, as everybody knows, but we are offering a product to our internal customers, and co-location providers are also offering a product to Google and indirectly to those customers. And so getting to that predictability can be very key, and it's very important to our internal folks. So what do we need from hyperscale vendors? So hopefully this kind of gets to the heart of what folks are trying to get out of this today, but I'll talk a little bit about what we look for. And this is a bit of an evolving process, actually. And I'll go into a little bit of detail in each one of these things. So number one is really aligning with our strategy, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It embodies a lot of the uncertainty that I've been talking about, and making sure that our co-location providers understand the uncertainty that we're trying to deal with. And so it's really understanding and aligning with that strategy. Flexible contract structures. Contracts are evolving, frankly, over time. And we used to do very standard, what I would call wholesale contracts. If I needed 5 megawatts somewhere, I'd go and get 5 megawatts. Maybe I'd have a 5 megawatt expansion that I may or may not trigger at some point. With GCP, those contract structures and the nuances of the contracts are much more complicated than they have been in the past. And so it's really understanding those contract structures and the kinds of things that we need are really important for folks to understand. Diverse product types. This really relates back to this concept of things like hybrid cloud. What do we do with all these corporate assets that are being left empty? There are all kinds of really interesting challenges in the marketplace that are being created by this tremendous growth in cloud. And it's really created this need to kind of diversify the product types to deal with these assets in more creative ways. And the last thing is competitive service models. This is really speaks, when I think about that, it really speaks to sort of the needs of hyperscale. When you get to a 20 or 30 megawatt kind of increment, what kind of service models are you dealing with? Is it a pure co-location outsource model? Is it more of a hybrid model where Google plays a role in the operation of the facility? And how do we deal with that? So I'll talk a little bit about aligning with our strategy. And this is really important. I've already alluded to some of these things. Flexibility, speed, and scale is really important to us. Now, we don't know exactly how fast our business needs will develop. And so we need partners that understand and they structure their business models around being able to flex up, to scale up, as quickly as possible. And I think another facet of this is being able to do this pretty much anywhere in the world. I talked about, the challenges of, especially in like an emerging market, and everybody's a little bit shy or hesitant to go into some emerging markets. But the players that go into those markets establish a foothold, establish the ability to build and develop co-location product in those markets, will certainly see the reward from that. The ability to move quickly in some of those markets and scale, and frankly, we're very much focused on building our giant hyperscale campuses. There's a lot of advantage to working with a third party that can give us that kind of flexibility in those kinds of markets. Actually, I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything, so I wrote down a couple notes. I would say as well that there's some benefit in making sure that the models that you put together, if you can get in early with us, if you can show the flexibility to grow with us, those are the kinds of models that we want to repeat around the world. And so it's very important to us, and we've seen some success in this. When we hammer through a difficult contract with somebody, that creates an incredible template for us to just be able to move to another region and be able to do that again. And working with you on pipeline. I get a lot of folks who come to us saying, hey, can you tell us where Google wants to be over the next 5 years? I cannot tell you where Google wants to be over the next 5 years. Part of that is because that's our sort of bread and butter, and that's sort of secret sauce, and I don't want to divulge that necessarily. But the more information I can get out of you, the better. And so working together with you on what the roadmap looks like, where you intend on being, where you're interested in going, it creates a very organic discussion where we begin to plan together. And we've been successful at kind of creating that dynamic with a lot of co-location providers. And so the better you can get at having those kinds of conversations, the better relationship you're going to be able to build with Google. And I talked a little bit about the unpredictability, thinking creatively about the development pipeline. And so Google has traditionally built very large campuses with multiple buildings on it. That's sort of what we've gotten very good at building. More and more, we're seeing co-location providers with multi-building campuses themselves. They're going much bigger. Where they used to have a 30-megawatt site, today they're coming to us and saying, hey, we've got a 120-megawatt site. That actually becomes very interesting to us. And then thinking about sort of that pipeline and how do we work with you to potentially get a spot in that pipeline at the lowest possible cost. And so it's sort of a reservation. How do we work with you again on a multi-year plan where we're not necessarily committing to 30 megawatts or 60 megawatts or whatever, but we're reserving a sort of position in your pipeline, and maybe we pay some amount for it that's negotiated. But again, it sort of speaks to that concept of creatively planning with you into the future and understanding exactly what your pipeline looks like. But I think the bottom line here when I talk about sort of flexibility and scale, when you think about the cloud product, it's really a software product. And it doesn't lend itself, when you're selling sort of this incremental service, it doesn't lend itself to incrementally building that infrastructure around it. And so the closer we can get to matching the performance of that demand, that sort of small, incremental, unpredictable growth, the more successful we will collectively be together. And I know that's an incredible challenge. We all develop big infrastructure projects, and you can't just snap your finger and have something built tomorrow. But the closer we can converge those things together, the more successful we'll be. All right, flexible contract structures, diverse product types. I'd say here the most important point is it is no longer just about price. When I used to do this work, when I used to talk about co-location providers, it was much more around sort of what's the best price. Okay, you have acceptable infrastructure, great, let's do a contract. Today what we're seeing is a sort of homogeneous pricing, really around the world. If you're in Mumbai or you're in Tokyo or wherever, the prices are generally pretty competitive across providers. And so I think the challenge for the co-location market is how do you position your product to be unique? And there are ways to do that. As we start talking sort of technical aspects of what we look for, especially with respect to Google Cloud product, we're looking for blocks of power. We're looking for blocks of expansion capability. We're looking for you to be able to tell us, okay, if you start with 2.5 megawatt block, we can deliver you another one within X amount of months. We have a supply chain in place to provide that kind of flexibility and that kind of ramp up for you. The ability to separate systems, especially with respect to GCP, we're looking for independent power. We're looking for independent redundancies. We're looking for, obviously, firewalls if you're located in the same building. Really working with us on what the actual topology of the layout of that infrastructure needs to be. It's not, gone are the days where we just take 5 megawatts in a single chunk in a single building, or 3 megawatts or whatever it is. We're now looking for X megawatts across 2 or 3 different buildings, maybe 2 or 3 different locations in a metro. And so the formula and the technical aspects of it have gotten much more complex than they used to be. I want to talk a little bit about supply chain too. And this actually speaks more broadly beyond cloud. Everybody knows we're having supply chain issues in this industry in general, right? It's not just on equipment and materials, it's on labor and certain trades, et cetera. There's a lot of advantage to working with co-location providers to provide a different supply chain or a parallel supply chain than the one that Google has. And this goes beyond cloud. Certainly there's a cloud aspect to it, but even when I talk about serving all of those other products, as supply chains tighten up, as resources tighten up, as a service provider to my company, I'm very interested to understand how you can provide me with an uninterrupted supply capacity. If I'm having issues building my hyperscale data centers, well, hold on a second, let me see what the third-party market or colocation market can do for me. And so I'm very interested in that strategy. Unique go-to-market opportunities. Talk a little bit, as we get into more sort of what I would consider to be exotic structures, we're talking 20, 30 megawatt builds. We're talking to companies more frequently now about joint ventures. Where's the capital coming from? Can we think about infrastructure funds and things like that? That's actually super interesting to me, is how do we begin to kind of expand the pie, participate together, especially as you get to those 10, 20, 30 megawatt increments. Do we do co-development? Are you doing a lot of the legwork for me, going out and finding a 120 megawatt site? And it gets back to that concept that I talk about getting an interest in that, which gives us some flexibility as we want to grow. I'm looking for diversity in my portfolio and optionality at a reasonable cost. And I think the co-location market is becoming much more sophisticated and kind of filling that role. You're essentially an in-house, you're an extension of our in-house delivery team. That's kind of how I would sum it up, and that's how I view it. The other thing is, we're talking to companies a lot about how they're financially structured. When we talk to REITs, right, they're looking for a particular return. They want to lease. They don't necessarily want Google to own the asset. We're seeing increasingly that they're starting to loosen up a little bit and saying, well, maybe you can own it if that really is important to you in year 7 or 8 or 10 or whatever it is. We're seeing more kind of build-to-suit optionality in the market. We're seeing more fee development opportunity, different varieties in terms of are they just delivering you a warm shell? Are they actually delivering you a full co-location facility with full service? What are the different varieties of product? And so it's really been inspiring to me compared to where we were 3 or 4 years ago when I would have conversations with traditional colos. It was very rigid. These are our returns. This is our business structure. We're not willing to do anything else. But we're seeing a lot of flexibility now where we did not see it before. And the companies that can shift their model a little bit are the ones that are going to be successful working with companies like us. And for some companies, it won't be right for them. Like some companies, it just doesn't meet their business structure. They need to have a different sort of return structure for their investors, and it just won't work. Some companies don't want to play in that 20 to 30 megawatt tranche. They really want to play in that 2 to 3 megawatt tranche, and they have a different business driver. And so it's important to understand sort of whether you actually want to play in this space or not. I'll talk a little bit just quickly about competitive service models. This really speaks to the concept of some shifts that we're seeing. We're talking to some companies about asset acquisition as an example. And so there's this really interesting dynamic happening in the marketplace where We talked to a lot of customers who are like, hold on a second, I would love to move to a cloud provider, but I just invested $100 million. Because obviously Google generally doesn't want to step in and say, I'll buy, okay, your $100 million data center that I have no use for. But we're beginning to see this shift happening, and data centers are being left potentially empty or less full than they used to be. And so we're beginning to have a lot of conversations with colocation providers about what to do with those assets. Is there an interest, for instance, in stepping in if it's in the right place and purchasing that asset? A lot of times, the customers will want to leave behind some compute, and so sometimes there's an anchor left in the building. That's great. That creates the cash flow that the buyer needs. But it's a tricky situation because in a lot of cases, these enterprises have overinvested in these facilities, and so we kind of call them gold-plated, and in a lot of cases, there's not much that you can do with them. But those are some things that we're talking about. I also talked about varying degrees of control and optionality. We're looking at different types of deals with colocation vendors. Sometimes they deliver us something that we will step in and manage the hardware aspects or the data center operations or security or whatever. Sometimes they provide a full service. And from my personal perspective, the more we can sort of pick and choose what layer or what layers of service we want in a facility, the better. So those are just a couple kind of high-level models that seem to be emerging. So I know I don't have a whole lot of time left, but this is a really important issue that I want to touch on around sustainability. Google is the largest buyer of renewable energy in history on the corporate side. We did our first project in 2010, which I personally negotiated. It's probably not as good as the contracts we negotiate today, but we were very proud of it. It was for a 114 megawatt wind project. We've been a carbon neutral company since 2007. We've now done over 3.5 gigawatts of renewable energy projects around the world. In 2017, we declared that we had purchased enough renewable energy on a megawatt hour to megawatt hour basis to match all of our energy consumption across Alphabet, not just the data centers, which are the majority of our electricity consumption, but all of Alphabet. And this is really important. So this speaks back to one of our core values. And it's something that's really important to our cloud customers. We're seeing a lot of RFPs where they're saying, hey, Google talks a lot about sustainability and renewables. What does that mean to me as I move over to GCP? And so we're fielding a lot of inquiries now from colocation providers saying, hey, Google, how did you do this? How did you instill this as an important thing that was supported by your executive leadership? And then how did you actually do it? Because we do very high standard projects. They're new projects to the grid. They're built for Google. They represent a pretty significant investment. And this is something that I would really emphasize colocation providers take seriously. This is a very serious issue. It's also because Google feels intrinsically that climate change is real, that data centers in particular will have a very big environmental impact with respect to energy use. And so as this industry proliferates even more around the world, this is actually a problem that we can work on together. It's not only something I'm asking of colocation providers, but I'm also asking for your participation in continuing to drive this momentum. And we're really empowering energy consumers across the board. We're driving costs lower. We're not just looking at renewables, because renewables, the sun's not always shining, the wind's not always blowing. The next threshold in the moonshot for us, and hopefully it's not a moonshot, hopefully it's achievable, is that we actually drive to a zero carbon grid, and that we actually drive to zero carbon supply in the data centers. So it's not just hoping that we have a project that's generating when we're operating our data center, which is 24/7, but it's also sort of mixing and matching contracts to make sure that that is always a zero carbon supply. It's probably changing regulation, and it's coming up with really interesting contract structures that we've never seen before. We support an organization. Google has been really key in sort of standing up Reba, which is the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. This is a plug for these folks. They have 150 corporations that are part of it. These are folks that have pledged to be 100% renewable. And I think there are probably 150-ish renewable energy developers that are also involved. And you've got Switch there, so colocation providers are beginning to join this as they realize, and beginning to really pay attention to this issue, as they realize this is very important to end users. Ultimately, we want this for everyone. This is not some trade secret thing at Google. This is not some secret sauce. We've been pretty open about this and about this formula. We really ultimately want this to be available for everybody. We think this is good for the world. We think this is a good way to run your business. We do think it's cheaper ultimately than what you otherwise get on the grid. It's also predictable. And renewables are really just the start. And the very last thing I wanted to talk about, this is also not necessarily something we're expecting of you, but maybe a call to action for our industry in general. It's this concept of the impact that we have in communities. I used to work in corporate site selection, and so I would do manufacturing plants around the world. And if we did a $50 or $100 million manufacturing facility somewhere, that was huge. And we hired 100 people. Oh my God, it was the biggest economic impact this town has ever seen. These data centers, Sundar, our CEO, announced $13 billion in intended investment in the United States a few months ago. Most of that is data center investment. Just the massive amount of economic development that this organization and colocation companies and the big cloud providers are driving is just massive, much bigger than we have ever seen in terms of direct capital investment. It's on the scale of a steel plant or an automotive OEM, et cetera. Granted, the jobs are not quite the same, and maybe the other impacts in the community may not be arguably quite the same. We need to really think about how we leverage that economic development. We really are creating jobs. We're really creating economic development in this country. What do we do with that? And that also speaks back to the sustainability issue in terms of the amount of buying power and the amount of impact that we have. And it's not just sustainability with respect to the environment, renewables, et cetera. It's also the talent pool, right? When we think about the incredible constraints and strain in our industry in terms of certain trades, diversity, women in our industry, there's a tremendous amount of work to do and just in terms of building the talent pool and the diversity that will be necessary to propel this industry forward in the coming years. And so this is more of a call to action to this group. We're really excited to be working with colocation providers, our partners in the tech world, to really create the infrastructure in a sustainable way to support our industry moving forward. So that's a quick cross-section of the stuff that we care about. Hopefully you've been able to glean something from that. I'm happy to chat with you in more detail about what we're looking for. But thank you so much for this opportunity. I appreciate it.